My name is Rakshita Purushottam.
I'm Lori Hayaza.
And Monica Schultz.
And before we start, I would like to ask if everyone has a copy of our presentation.
No. Oh, here.
Thank you. We're here representing the State University of New York at Potsdam. And
You started your timer yet?
Yes.
We're here representing the State University of New York from Potsdam, and our case today is on the pharmaceutical industry, specifically the generic drug compounding crisis. On today's agenda, we'll be discussing technical difficulties. I apologize.
I don't know what this is.
On today's agenda, we will be discussing the drug compounding, what exactly it is. We'll be going through some real-life stories of drug compounding. We'll be discussing the New England Compounding Center, the ethical issues, the legal issues, the financial issues, as well as, lastly, we'll give you the recommendation based on the research that we have done. We would like you guys as judges to play the role of the Congressional Hearing Committee, and we would like to assume the role of consultants hired by the Congressional Hearing Committee to give you a stance on the drug compounding crisis and why, in fact, it is a crisis, and our recommendation based on the research that we have done. I will continue on to talk about drug compounding in general. There's two different forms of drug compounding that's generally used. There's the traditional version and the non-traditional version. The traditional form of drug compounding was what drug compounding originally started as. It was used to combine, the drug compounding facilities, were used to combine two or more FDA-approved drugs to be used on patients that were not getting a reaction with just normal FDA-approved drugs. And now we use non-traditional drug compounding, and that's more common, and that's what our case today is primarily going to focus on. And non-traditional drug compounding is when facilities actually make bulk quantities of essentially copycat FDA-approved drugs. And there's been various different issues surrounding this, and we'll go more into that later in the presentation. There are various FDA regulations as well as state regulations surrounding the drug compounding industry. Unfortunately, when it comes to the FDA regulations, there really isn't anything for each individual facility. There's just overall regulations saying that the facilities cannot produce the drugs in bulk quantities because they are essentially copycats of FDA-approved drugs. And also when it comes to state laws, the states all have different laws. It's on a state-by-state basis. So you can go to Massachusetts where they have completely different laws than the state of Rhode Island, for example, and that causes some issues there because you don't know how the quality control laws in Massachusetts versus Rhode Island. And when you are a patient receiving any kind of medication from a physician, you're not going to know what standard these drugs were produced in. And most people, they don't question the drugs that their physician gives them. They trust the physician to make the choice to get the drugs from a reputed source. And I'm going to now talk about the New England Compounding Center and the case that we are specifically going to be mentioning today. The New England Compounding Center is a compounding facility located out of Massachusetts. And what they did was they produced a steroid injection, which is commonly prescribed for lower back pain. And due to lack of quality control, a strain of fungal meningitis was introduced into this batch. And this batch of steroid injections was distributed in over 19 states, and over 700 people were affected because of this lack of quality control. And lastly, I'm going to talk about some red flags in the compounding industry. There's been several complaints about the lack of quality in the compounding industry, but these complaints have not been recognized, and nothing's been done to make this better. And there's a lot of complaints also have been resulted from the copycat drugs that these compounding facilities have produced, and there still has not been much that's been done to please the patients who have made these complaints. And we're going to go with Lauren, and she's going to tell you about some real life stories now.
Okay, so to put in perspective the severity of this crisis, we have we have two specific cases that really portray what's happened because of the New England Compounding Company. We have Patricia Schmiedeneck, who last April was in a car accident, and she, after the car accident, was experiencing some lower back pain. And soon after, she went to the doctor and she received the steroid injection in her lower back, which clearly did her way more harm than good. And she was out of work by October. She's a school teacher. She has 2 daughters. Her husband has completely taken time off of work to take care of her and their 2 children. He's no longer working. She takes 4 hours worth of medication through an IV in her room every single day. Her room is now essentially a hospital room, and her friends have actually decided to have a fundraiser for her because her medical bills are piling up. And I mean, imagine your husband, your wife, your significant other, having them take 4 hours of medication every day, having 2 young children to have to explain that to. I mean, it blows our minds. When we did the research, it was just, we couldn't imagine being in that position. And she had no idea, as right there you see the quote, she had no idea that the shot that she was getting was coming from this small facility next to a dump of all places. It's heartbreaking. We also have George Carey, who he watches the clock every single day because him and his wife both got the same exact lower back pain, the same shot in August of last year. His wife, at 67 years old, was put on life support after she suffered a very severe stroke. He had the same shot given to him. By September, she had passed away. Now he watches the clock every single day to make sure that he's not going to have any of the same symptoms, and he's taking antifungal treatments as well. But he doesn't know if he's going to wake up tomorrow morning. He has no idea what this medication is going to do for him. He lives every day hoping that he's going to wake up and live the next one, and he feels as if he has lost his best friend. And now we will hand this over to Monica so she can explain to you what the NECC really is.
Thank you, Lauren. I just want to make you a little more familiar with the New England Compounding Center as a company. I'm going to discuss the specific details of the case, when it happened, who it affected, and the cost. And this is all going to tie into later when my colleagues and I discuss the ethical, legal, and financial aspects of the case. The New England Compounding Center was listed as a medical compound-only pharmacy based in Massachusetts, whose purpose was to create customized medications for patients that perhaps didn't have an effect from the FDA-approved drug or just had a drug allergy. And what happened in the case was, as you recently may have heard in the news, there was a meningitis outbreak. It was a national crisis. The New England Compounding Center was actually tied to this. You can see in the, excuse me, can you go back, please? I'm sorry. On the right, we have a picture of the spinal fluid that actually was in one of the patients, and the fungus has grown in the spinal fluid. The New England Compounding Center released 17,000 vials to 3,000 hospitals and clinics across the United States. And after this vial was released, the patients were given this steroid, which is normally used to treat lower back pain. And shortly after this, the people started falling ill, and eventually people started dying as well. This all began in early to mid-September of 2012, and is still affecting people today. And this picture up here displays when it started becoming more nationally known, and it was on the national news, and it evolved quickly into a national crisis. There are many entities that were affected by this meningitis outbreak, including the New England Compounding Center itself, who was actually shut down. Its license was revoked and has recently filed for a Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Next would be the hospitals and clinics, as well as the doctors that administer the drug. Their names and reputations are on the line because, of course, as a patient, you would immediately blame the doctor for anything that's gone wrong with a medicine. Next would be the families of the people that were stricken with meningitis have to take care of their loved ones on a daily basis, or are grieving the loss of a loved one, or in George Carey's case, had to take his own partner off of life support. And finally, of course, the patients themselves that were infected with meningitis are directly affected emotionally, physically, and their lives have changed forever. Evidence points to the cause of all of this is the lack of sterilization in the compounding facility itself, the lack of adequate inspections, or the lack of inspections in general just not happening. And because of this, an airborne fungus leaked into the steroid, and the company either did not notice this or did not care to fix it. As you can see, here we have a graph, and on the right side of the graph is, in the red, represents the rising number of cases, and the red line corresponds with the right side of the graph, and it begins in mid-September of 2012, and the right side of the graph is the green, and the green line corresponds with this right side of the graph. And this represents the number of deaths that is continuing to rise. The graph starts in mid-September and ends in mid-January of 2013, but as you can see, the numbers are still rising and people are still being affected today. People are still dying today from this case. And as of January 26, 2013, there are 678 cases and 44 deaths, but of course this number has risen since. Now that you know the basic details of the case, I'm going to move into the ethical issues of this case. The aspects of the ethical issues I'm going to discuss are quality assurance, the Massachusetts State Code of Conduct, the Pharmacy Compounding Accreditation Board, the general rules and regulations of a drug manufacturing company versus a compound-only company, and then I'm going to go into how the FDA was involved with this. Now, if you don't already know, quality assurance is defined as a system of actions that is taken to assure the quality of a product with reasonable confidence. And clearly, the New England Compounding Center did not abide by this and was negligent of quality assurance, because quality assurance should occur in every stage of production, but this did not happen. Each company doesn't have to have a specific code of conduct per company, because there is a statewide recognized code of conduct, and Massachusetts has supposedly the strictest of the nation for the code of conduct. And a couple of the elements that are in the Massachusetts State Code of Conduct are the adoption and reporting of a training program to the Board of Health, along with verifying with the Board of Health that the regulations for that company are being followed, and if these are not being followed, the investigative measures must also be reported to the Department of Health. And the New England Compounding Center clearly did not abide by this either. There's separate rules for the compound-only facility versus a drug manufacturing company. A compound only is on a per patient basis. It has a lot more laxed regulations versus the drug manufacturing. All the products that come out of this do not have to be approved by the FDA, and this is what the New England Compounding Center listed itself as and classified itself as. So that's what everyone knew it as. But it was operating as a drug manufacturing company, which is supposed to be under the microscope of the FDA, has very strict regulations. Everything that comes out of that kind of company has to be approved by the FDA. And so basically the New England Compounding Center was operating as a drug manufacturing company, but did not want to play by the rules of the drug manufacturing company. The Pharmacy Compounding Accreditation Board is referred to find compounding centers that are devoted to quality. By being accredited by this board, it gives society confidence that the proper regulations are being followed, and it gives the community confidence also in the fact that your drugs are safe and are adequate for what they need. And the unfortunate part about this is the New England Compounding Center was not accredited by this board. It was recently reported that the FDA knew about what was going on in the New England Compounding Center, but did nothing. virtually nothing about this. The only thing that it did do was in 2006, it sent the New England Compounding Center a warning letter, but nothing was enforced, and the New England Compounding Center essentially blew it off and didn't care about it. Because they were getting away with what they were doing, and nobody was doing anything about it. And this leads me to the main ethical issues of the case, which would be greed as well as negligence, blatant negligence. The company evolved so quickly from a compound only to a drug manufacturing company that is making so much profit, and that profit was not being put toward the proper sterilization of the facility, and it was not being put toward the upkeep of the facility to be adequate for the society. And because of this, hundreds of people's lives have changed forever, and 53 people are dead.
Now I'll go into some of the legal implications of this case. The New England Compounding Center actually opened its doors in 1998, and less than a year after it opened its doors in 1999, they received a citation from the state of Massachusetts for having blank prescription pads inside the facility. Even though they received a citation, there was no follow-up investigation on this to make sure that there was no more blank prescription pads in the facility. There were also various state and FDA violations that the New England Compounding Center violated, and the state violations that they violated were, or the regulations that they violated, were the fact that the New England Compounding Center was not checking for potency of the drugs that they were manufacturing. So the patients that were getting the drugs did not know the strength of the drugs that they were getting. And that definitely raises a red flag. I mean, when you go into a pharmacy and you buy a bottle of Advil, you see it clearly labeled as 200 milligrams. And even though that these drugs that they were getting from the New England Compounding Center had a label, they were not sure the actual strength of the drugs that they were receiving. And also, when it comes to state violations, they also produced the drugs in bulk quantities. They were shipping it out to hospitals, which was illegal, and usually when the pharmacies send out, or compounding pharmacies send out the drugs to anyone, there has to be a patient name that goes along with the shipment, and the New England Compounding Center did not have a patient name that went with the shipment. They were just producing drugs in mass quantities and just distributing it out to various different states. When it comes to FDA violations, the Code 503A of the FDA Code of Conduct states that compounding centers can actually make larger amounts of drugs in limited quantities. To clarify this point, it means that when the compounding center has a regular patient that they're getting prescriptions for from a physician, and this patient is dependent on these drugs, the compounding center can actually produce a larger quantity of these drugs, but they're not allowed to ship it out until the prescription comes in. And the the New England Compounding Center clearly violated this. Number one, they were producing drugs in large quantities. Number two, they were making copycat generic versions. Number three, they weren't checking for potency, they weren't checking for quality, and yet they were shipping out all these drugs to various places without even a prescription. And then the pharmacy licenses were revoked, according to the slide. You can see the New England Compounding Center itself, as a company, lost its pharmacy license, and they were not allowed to produce or manufacture any kind of drugs in the state of Massachusetts. The three main pharmacists that worked in the New England Compounding Center also had their pharmacy licenses revoked, and they are no longer allowed to be pharmacists in the state of Massachusetts. There was also a multi-district litigation that occurred due to this crisis, and the patients that are the victims of this negligence, like you can say, were compensated not only for the medical bills that they had to they incurred because of this negligence, but also because due to the emotional distress. They also the travel expenses that occurred with this. In fact, there was a man in Tennessee who had to travel 4 hours a week just to get the medication that he required to overcome this negligence of the New England Compounding Center, and he was compensated for his travel expenses as well as his medical bills. And Lauren will discuss the financial issues now.
So the NECC has gone bankrupt, as we mentioned before. Reasons being, in 2010, first off, they had $20 million in profits. In 2012, there was $32 million in profits with a quarter of the year left. The owner, Barry Cadden, and his wife Lisa were spending way too freely on company credit cards. Dave & Buster's, Starbucks, jewelry stores, any store, you name it, they were there spending. He would receive a bi-weekly salary of $18,000, and their facility that they own to make this steroid is clearly not sterile. It's not clean. As Patricia Schmiedeneck was saying before, she didn't realize it was coming from the small facility next to a dump. They should have been using all of this money that they were making to make sure the facility was clean in the first place, because then people like George Carey and Patricia would not have had to suffer immensely the way that they have. It's unfair and it's unethical, and it's just, there's no reason that any of this should have happened if it was avoidable, but because of this company's negligence, it blew up in their faces. They became greedy. All they wanted was money, and now people that are just victims of this, innocent victims, are suffering and their lives are at stake. And because of this, we have come up with some recommendations, and I will bring this to Rock Shifa to tell you about those.
Our recommendations are not only based on the Newland Compounding Center individually. I would like to bring to your attention that although we focused our case today on the Newland Compounding Center, this is a national crisis. Just last month, there was a news article saying that over 30 compounding centers in the country have had various citations for the lack of cleanliness, the lack of quality control, the lack of testing for potency, the lack of creating these drugs in a sterile environment. And in fact, there's the brother-in-law of the owner of the Newland Compounding Center, Barry Cadden. He is the CEO of a company called Ameridose, and they have also based out of Massachusetts, and they have also received various citations for the red flags that I talked about earlier, and yet there's nothing done. So our recommendations are based on the crisis in general. Our first recommendation is to have a more strict FDA regulation on the compounding industry. State by state regulations allow for mishaps to happen, and even this mishap in general happened in the state of Massachusetts, which had the strictest regulations on the drug compounding industry, and this still happened. So we recommend that the FDA has a tighter grip on the compounding industry. They have inspections, more frequent inspections, and actually do something about it. And then the second recommendation going along with this is that we don't allow for the compounding industry to go to non-traditional forms of compounding, which is producing drugs in a bulk amount. The compounding industry originated to produce drugs for patients that were not reacting to FDA-approved drugs, and the drugs were mixed together to provide the patients with relief for whatever ailments that they may have had. And we want to go back to that. And our recommendation is to go back to traditional compounding, but have strict FDA regulations on it. And now we'll open up the floor to any questions that you guys may have.
Thank you very much.
I'll start with the last part and we'll go forward into other things.
Absolutely.
You mentioned your recommendation is to have stricter regulations, in other words, more enforcement.
Absolutely.
And a big concern inside of companies, of course, is the cost of increased compliance with regulations. Have you, in your recommendation, considered the increased cost on the pharmaceutical industry if they were to implement your...
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of the times these companies are producing bulk quantities of generic drugs to lower the cost. But when it comes to a human life, if you know that we go to a doctor for a very common steroid back injection, personally, I would rather pay more and pay a higher insurance rate to have something that will actually fix the ailment that I went in there for than getting a shot that would risk my health and risk my life. And I think when it comes down to it, I think most people, if they knew that something that they were taking was making them, a drug that they were taking that was intended to make their life better was in fact putting their life at risk, I think a majority of the people would either pay higher health costs or insurance rates to make sure that their life was stable and they were getting the proper medication that they needed.
Especially after it being so nationally recognized, people see what the dangers are now, and it brings it into question for them.
Early Early on, you mentioned that doctors would prescribe these compounded drugs and patients would simply take them as expected. Can you address the ethical concerns or ethical issues that the doctors face? Especially since I'm going to assume in some cases they're financially prompted to by these companies to prescribe certain drugs.
Absolutely. Actually, when it comes to compounding centers, there's another FDA regulation that prohibits compounding centers to advertise to hospitals. So when it comes to doctors, they actually are doing it more for the lower cost of the drugs, I believe, more than them getting sponsored to actually sell or give these drugs to their patients. And I think one of the ethical issues that physicians face is the fact whether to provide the lower healthcare costs that everyone looks for now, or to provide the best and the most the drugs that are more expensive to their patients.
Yeah, I agree.
So basically, a financial decision.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Were there any implications to the physicians that prescribe these drugs? Were they, you may have mentioned that, I might have missed it, but did
Loss of patients.
Yeah.
I mean, if your physician if you found out your physician and prescribed drugs from you were a compounding center, I'm pretty sure they would lose a lot of their patients. So that's one pretty big implication.
But they weren't actually
No.
reprimanded
No.
anyway? Okay.
Are you, by mentioning that the Pharmacy Compounding Accrediting Board didn't have any jurisdiction over this organization, this company, because they weren't members, correct?
Right.
Right.
Are you suggesting that there's some expectation that you want compounding companies to fall under some kind of national association or status? I mean, it seems that it's a complex problem anyway, from what you've said, because if each state if a company is responsible to individual states, and state laws vary.
Right.
And Massachusetts is the best, and you appropriately chose the tightest to show us the problems. In addition to the FDA being more accountable, I'm wondering, having raised the issue of the National Accrediting Group, if your research told you that there would be any benefits, or if there are any other solutions around that you might suggest.
Maybe each compounding center should have to be accredited by a board such as professional societies such as this. Maybe not specifically the Pharmacy Compounding Accreditation Board, but something that is of that standard.
Yeah.
I don't think we mentioned that specifically because the common person today, when they're getting their drugs, I think most people look at the FDA website when it comes to recalls and any issues that comes to the Food and Drug Administration, and they don't look to see if their drug was manufactured in a facility that was accredited by the Pharmaceutical Accreditation Board. So as ideal as it would be to be accredited, I think the FDA regulations, the stricter FDA regulations would be the first step in preventing this from happening again.
Maybe some of the hospitals and clinics could require them to only work with compounding centers that are accredited by the board, and a board such as that. That could also be another step.
And does the FDA have some jurisdiction to write recommendations to hospitals and others about problems like this?
Absolutely. I mean, the FDA the hospitals look to provide FDA-approved drugs in the first place, so the FDA definitely would have jurisdiction to provide some kind of recommendation as per what manufacturing or what compounding facilities to accept drugs from and whatnot.
Okay, I'll open up to others. I wanted to follow up on this. So if you were to suggest, when you say tighter regulations from the FDA, if you were to suggest from an ethical basis of impact, what are 3 things that you think the FDA could do that would, in the tighter restrictions, not just legally, but that would have an immediate impact on the ethics of the operations of these organizations, what would you suggest?
That's a really good question.
I think the first thing that the FDA could do is inspections. If the New England Compounding Center, even though they had various citations and they had some inspections, they knew that they were going to get away with it, and the FDA was not going to come back. So they cut corners, and they did not need to comply with whatever the FDA said. So if the compounding centers actually knew that the FDA was coming in on a regular basis for inspections, and the FDA actually, anytime a problem arose during the inspections, the FDA actually went back and checked up on it and made sure that whatever they recommended was complied with. I think that would be the first step in making sure that the company stayed ethical. And another aspect of the FDA, I don't think, should be afraid to shut down a company when it comes to a human life. If in the New England Compounding Center, if they received a citation for blank prescription pads less than a year after it opened its doors, that waves a huge red flag in my face. And I think that it's been from 1998 to 2013, there's been so many different citations. I think the FDA should have either shut down the facility altogether or put the facility on some kind of probation.
Absolutely.
And the third recommendation I can think of is to make sure that all states have the same regulation. I mean, as I said before, there's been 30 different companies in just the past month that have there's been issues with, and I think regulation and then going through with the regulation process and making sure that the companies are inspected and preventative measures for something like this are taken would be the three main important
To
things.
keep them in line, especially, because I mean, with our company specifically, they got greedy and then they got sloppy because they got comfortable and they thought they were going to get away with it, and it was just all they saw was money in front of them, and they didn't think about who they were affecting. So
We actually watched a video of an interview of one of the employees of the New England Compounding Center, and he mentioned that he went to the supervisors numerous times and said, "This isn't right," and he said his exact words that their response was a shrug, and he said that their response was a shrug for pretty much everything, that every issue that was brought to them, and that the company was a mistake waiting to happen. That's what he said in the video.
Even these employees are afraid of whistleblowing, and they should not be. And I think it's up to the FDA to make sure that even the employees feel comfortable enough to come out and tell the FDA if the company is doing something legal, because they're the ones behind the doors of the company, and they're going to know it best of what's occurring behind closed doors.
I'd like to follow up on that question. You defined one of the ways that you can handle this. What are the other two? I only heard one. The previous judge had asked if you could give three different ways that this could be resolved or helped by your recommendations.
Right.
What are the other two?
I think they're all kind of interlinked. But the first one would be the investigation, as I said before. And then the second way was to make sure that the companies complied with any recommendations made during the investigation. And then the third way would be to make sure that there is a state or a national level regulation and not just state by state.
Thank you.
Yes.
So I had a question. Given that there is right now, state by state regulations, and it's some are stricter, like in Massachusetts versus other states, and the time it would take to get, across the board set of regulations that every state would follow, the lobbying it would take at the federal level to make that happen. What is going on in terms of at the state level for oversight? Because to me, while I feel like the FDA has a great role in this is also a state issue. And where was the state oversight in making sure that their regulations were being followed and adhered to? So are there inspections at the state level happening? And maybe the first step is to tighten those state oversight before the FDA.
Great. Definitely there were state regulations, there were inspections, but did they follow through with their inspections? That's a question. Even just like any kind of ethical issue, you can't blame it on one party. Even though the NECC was the one that essentially manufactured the drugs and distributed it, it was also, you can also put the blame on the state of Massachusetts as well as the FDA. They should, as a national level department that the citizens look up to, they should have made it their number one priority to make sure that these drugs that are injected into humans are in compliance with the regulations. Both and the state of Massachusetts should have as well.
Maybe also, instead of having a statewide code of conduct, maybe each company should be required to comply with their own code of conduct as well. That's similar to the state one, because I could not find a code of conduct for New England Compounding Center, because some companies do have one and some don't. New England Compounding Center did not. They also, when this crisis happened, they deleted their website, and when you called there was no answer. Nobody was
As if they never.
Right, they just kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
Do they continue doing business without a website?
No, they're shut down.
The products
after
were
11
recalled, yeah.
bankruptcy.
The products were recalled.
So, one of the things I'm thinking here too is that there still has to be some responsibility on the physicians that administer these drugs.
Yeah.
Because you look at cases like, you go to, I think in the 90s when there were 4 deaths from E. coli at Jack in the Box, people weren't, their first thing was Jack in the Box killed these people. It wasn't the beef producer, the farmer that produced this beef. It was the company that administered this product that hurt people. So there's obviously a greater need for regulation and inspection on the back end. But also I think that the company that's administering these drugs, like any restaurant that would administer food, should know their sources and should hold their sources accountable for quality products. Was there any discussion or, thinking when you guys were looking at this case that there should also be some sort of tracking mechanism or rating system from drug manufacturers that are providing the drugs to these doctors?
Right, yeah, like the hospitals and clinics shouldn't have gone through a compounding center that wasn't accredited with.
That clearly had some red flags.
It was really,
That should have been a red flag
really
itself.
iffy. Yeah, they were taking a chance gambling.
I agree with you completely on the fact that physicians do take responsibility. But going to your Jack in the Box example, when you look at franchise, the physicians, doctors don't have a franchise where you can blame physicians in general. And this was a drug that was distributed to 17,000 vials were distributed in the United States. So there's not, if you blame physicians, you can't blame like a franchise of physicians. So I think when people do look into who to blame, they look at where the drugs came from, and that's where the New England Compounding Center were blamed. Mm-hmm. But I definitely agree with you saying that the physicians who ended up getting these drugs should have also faced some kind of repercussion for it.
Yeah, there should be responsibility on
Absolutely.
every step along the way.
Right. What did they think when they saw blank prescriptions?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And some prescriptions said Homer Simpson and John Doe on them, and they were just fictional names, or they were just blank.
Yeah.
Why would you?
It's almost like laziness on their part because they didn't
Right.
research where their prescription medications were coming from.
Right.
So,
Following through on the thread of personal responsibility, Monica, you mentioned that you had all watched a video about one of the employees, the person bringing his or her concerns to the attention of the owners multiple times. Can you address the responsibility of the individuals who work there? They knew there were problems, and yet they continued to work there.
I think it was maybe a fear of losing their job, as
Which
selfish as that
happens
sounds. Right. Maybe they didn't want to put everybody out of jobs and themselves out of jobs, because as selfish as that sounds, maybe they thought, oh, well, it won't happen to us.
yeah. They didn't want to be responsible for what happened anyways.
Right.
And he was
Right.
really crazy.
But put yourself in that position.
Right.
Ethically speaking,
Right.
what would you do?
I think that goes back to the point I made earlier. They shouldn't be afraid to whistleblow.
Right.
Yeah.
It's as working for a company like that. I think it's it's our responsibility of any employee to make sure the company is ethical. And are the employees at fault? Absolutely, they should have definitely spoken up. And personally, if I was an employee there, I could not be an employee knowing that I was producing some kind of drug that was affecting human lives.
Absolutely.
Like I would probably quit. It all depends on personal, like what your personal ethics are. I know touching base on another ethical issue, many people with the social networking thing that we talked about yesterday, some companies ask you to actually provide login information. Some people go ahead and provide their interviewer with their login information for their social networking sites. Others decide to just walk away from the interview and said that that's not the company they want to work for. And it's all about your personal ethics.
He was very courageous to come forward and identify himself as an employee and say what was happening, especially after it happened, because he knows that he could be put at fault as well because he didn't.
For someone to shrug as a response to that,
Right.
it's just, if that was us, I know all of us would just, we completely would not, I would just be like, I can't be part of this. I would absolutely quit. Just because you think about it and like what happens when, say, your mom or your dad or your sister or brother or someone you know goes and gets this shot, that you're working for the company that's making this.
Right.
Like, what are you gonna lie to your family
Can't
and
say,
say,
"Don't take
go and get it, sure, and then, they say, oh my gosh, I have this meningitis infection now. I'd be like, well, I knew you were gonna, like, how is that even, you know what I mean? It's just, I would not stand for that at all.
Any more questions?
You mentioned that from an ethical standpoint, greed and negligence were the two issues that you felt were the most at issue. Now, the FDA can't address greed.
Right. No, that's right.
So, could you dig a little deeper
Absolutely.
about what you really are talking about? Because obviously in the financial crisis, greed's a word that's thrown around as an explanation for things going wrong.
Right.
Dig deeper for me if you would.
They're greedy because, like I said before, they're operating as a drug manufacturing company and we're not playing by those rules. And they're making a lot of money by doing this. You make a lot of money as a drug compounding, a manufacturing company, and they didn't have to spend the extra money on keeping up with the strict regulations. So they are making more money by doing this and just masking.
So are you talking also about how companies need to be classified? If there's a loophole about, and that's where greed comes in as a confusion
Right.
for maybe masking something that may have another kind of fix as well, because greed is something really hard for us to change.
Right. That goes back to going back to traditional compounding versus non-traditional compounding. The New England Compounding Center, instead of creating drugs on a per patient basis, they started creating bulk quantities of drugs, which kind of crosses the line with manufacturing. So by going back to traditional compounding, which is our second recommendation, they would be producing drugs on a patient basis and not bulk producing it. And because it's on a patient-by-patient basis, they're not going to be making as profits at such an exponential rate as they would be when they were manufacturing. And because there would be FDA regulations based on what they can and cannot do, and there would be investigations and stuff like that, more of the company money would be used towards quality control and making sure the facility runs smoothly as per FDA regulations. So in this case, Barry Caden, if there were strict FDA regulations, he would not be using all the company profits on his own, however he wanted to spend it. He'd be making sure that they were complying with strict FDA regulations. Otherwise, he'd be bankrupt like he is today.
Exactly.
So your suggestion is that there was a loophole in terms of how the company was able to classify itself, but it didn't hold
Yes.
itself accountable, or wasn't held accountable. So are you suggesting that there be then an inability for, you may have already explained it, I just want to make sure I understand, that the FDA's tighter regulations, does that also go to how the FDA requires people to operate in terms of they had a nice deal of operating on both sides of the aisle from what you're saying? Would stricter regulations solve that problem, or would some kind of separation of what companies are able to operate in? Does that make sense?
Right. I think the reason we think that stricter regulations would solve that greed issue would be because the CEO of the New England Compounding Center knew that he would be able to get away with whatever violations that occurred when they did investigations. He never used the company money to make sure that the facility was running smoothly and to fix whatever violations that he had. He used that money on himself. So if the strict regulations were put in place and the CEOs of these companies and the higher execs knew that the FDA was going to come back and make sure that they were going to comply with whatever recommendations that they had for whatever violations that they had, or the company was going to get shut down, I would make the assumption that the CEOs and the top execs would make sure that the company was not shut down. That's a good job for them. So I I think that's,
Any more questions, anyone? Now we go into the third phase, which is I'm going to invite each of the judges to give you feedback on anything that occurs to them that would be helpful to you each individually as you do other presentations or as you think about the kinds of arguments that you make and how you support it, or even though you're not going to be competing in another round, if you were, what they think, what we think, you might have thought of that might be useful to you in the second round that it isn't going to happen. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to put everyone on the spot, but I'm going to start with you, Hal.
Sure.
And just ask, everyone to say whatever they can to be helpful to you collectively or individually.
Good. I was very impressed overall with the presentation. All levels were addressed more.
Is everybody here connected with SUNY?
Yes, I'm the advisor.
Great, and you, sir? Then I'm going to ask you to leave because you may be representing another team.
Oh, no, I'm not.
You're not?
Yeah, I'm just observing because my university may enter the competition next year.
Okay.
So I have no interest, so conflict of interest.
Okay. The suggestion that
That's
Tom
fine.
White, no, I don't want to set you up, but the suggestion that Tom White made is that, and I guess in your case it's all right, that if we had people here who were competing, they would see where the judges were going.
Right.
Right.
And they would take that and potentially use that to strengthen their own. In your case, that's a moot point because you don't have a team competing today.
Right.
So I just needed to know to protect the hard work that they've done. I just needed to know that
I
you.
understand.
Okay, so having interrupted you, I should have clarified that in the beginning. So we're good.
The presentation, one of the things that you did very, very well is you build a fire and then you put it out. And,
I like that saying.
and that comes from Franklin Roosevelt. So his fireside, no, I did not. But I was very impressed with the individual presentations and the follow-up between all the connection, where one question was asked of Rashika, and you addressed my question, and there was a follow-up all the way down the line. This is a very good way to communicate and clarify an issue. And I thought that was good.
Thank you.
The one area that I would look at on an individual basis is how you address the beginning statement, going back to building the fire and putting it out, which is when you address coming back to an issue, to summarize it very quickly and then go back into addressing the answer to the question. And I thought that was the only part, but I thought that was quite well done. And on an individual basis, each one of you has a way where they're, on an individual basis or as a team, that I want to hear more. Because you're the eye contact and the drawing me in, so that I want to ask more questions and because I trust your answers.
Thank you.
I can second everything that was just said. You're all very personable, which is welcome. And I thought you also did a great job in the handoffs. One thing that I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of is a clear analysis, and granted time is limited, but a clear analysis of all the parties involved. You focused on the FDA, you focused on the owners. We touched a little bit on the employees and a little bit on the states. But each one of those individuals had ethical responsibility and conflicts. And it would have been nice to discuss a little bit about the struggles of each of those parties a little bit more, if possible.
Yes, I think very well done. You all had a great ease with your presentation. I guess my main critique would be in providing, solutions or options, recommendations. So always be careful with suggesting a code of conduct. A code of conduct, let's say is only as good as the paper. If you're not enforcing it, Enron had a model code of conduct, and look what happened. That only can take you so far. That's, the beginning. That's something that you always are you want to encourage your employees to go back to, but it also takes, an organizational culture, like you said. If the manager's going to shrug at clear violations, the company is as a whole is just going to shrug. So I guess looking more into how you change the culture and the conversation when these sorts of issues occur at the site level, at the state, at the national. I think just getting more into that and really finding that way to compel people to do the right thing. I think that makes us stronger. That would definitely strengthen an already great
Yeah, I agree with everyone. You guys did great. You look great. You are very passionate about what you're talking about. And definitely, there's a lot of, I can tell you're very educated on the subject, far more than I was. So it's very interesting. I know I'd say just technique-wise, because in theory, I totally agree with the suggestions here. And it's something I'm always guilty of is I talk really fast. And I know there was a lot of information to present in a short amount of time. But maybe take breath and slow down at points when especially at points where you're really trying to kind of hone in on what you're showing us. But the flow was really good. Your setup was good, and you each really took a piece of responsibility in the presentation. So congratulations, you did a great job.
Thank you.
I think that you each presented with poise, as was said, which establishes credibility. So I think that's essential. When slides don't work, when you say something that you wanted to say better or differently, don't apologize.
Okay.
Because that immediately erodes a little bit of the credibility your presence is already established. It's a natural thing to do, but I think it's really important, once you start the presentation, you're the experts. Don't ever give us a reason not to feel that you're not. And it's a small thing, but that's one of the things that carries over into other things. Because especially when you're dealing with something like ethics, as has been said, the credibility that you each possess, and you earned it immediately in the serious way in which you went about it, that was terrific. I think that as I think about the audience you asked us to be, Congress has been accused of greed. So, everyone can be accused of greed. They also were accused of not doing enough in the financial crisis. When any of us watching the hearings saw clearly that there were issues that weren't. So, while I think you did a terrific job with the negligence, and I would add to that if you hadn't been asked the question of what are the top 3 things, you might not have had your audience know what you felt the top 3 things were. So it's useful to be really concrete about what you wanted the FDA to do. As it relates to greed, I break that down and I think about, because there are people who, from a very pro-business standpoint, would think that you were really attacking profit. And they wouldn't listen to you anymore. And that's not what you're doing. But you've got a bias when you're talking to any group, whether it's Congress or someone else, that they have individual ideas. So the language you use needs to be neutral enough that it doesn't flag my existing bias or my existing, whatever, anybody's existing. And I think as you think about greed, the capacity to focus on the societal implications might have helped you get some of your points. And the audience of Congress has an accountability to respond to that societal obligation. And you did address it nicely in other parts of it. But I think you could really fold that in a more impactful way, so that not to be heard is essentially to have the impact that people don't care about, the impact on society. Because part of what you're doing is selling us on something we may not want to do. Do you have any questions? Does anyone else have anything else to say? I think you did a terrific job. Do you have any questions of us that are helpful to you in terms of anything, because you've invested, how many hours have you invested?
How many lost weekends?
So many. Plus we have other classes.
So you've made it a huge investment. in
Oh,
this.
yes. Very, very much.
Did you?
I did have one more comment to add in the positive side. That is, this is a competition about ethics, and it's tough to tie ethics to concrete things. I thought you did a very good job of identifying the ethical values in the community and the harm that's done when things are not handled correctly. And the definition of that came through very, very well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions of us?
No, thank you. Thank you very much for listening to us.
Thank you so much.
Please feel that the time that you've invested resulted in a really great presentation.
Thank you.
And a really serious issue that most
absolutely.
people, not even on the radar. So congratulations.
Thank you. Very much. Thank you.
Very, very
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet
Thank
you.
you. Thank you very much.
Didn't mean to shut you off. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you guys for your
My hand
time
might
too.
bubble. Sorry.
Those suggestions were really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. I'm actually just honored to be here.
Yeah.
I'm just so excited to come and participate.